Hey everyone, it's Jason, producer of Data and Biotech. Quick one, every episode of this podcast is now on YouTube with animated glossaries that break down the technical terms we discuss. Just search Data and Biotech on YouTube to watch. Welcome to Data and Biotech, a podcast from Cordi where we explore how companies leverage data to drive innovation in life sciences. Every 2 weeks, we sit down with an expert from the world of biotechnology to understand how they're using data science to solve technical challenges, streamline operations, and further innovation in their business. Here we go.
Kyle Smith and Jake Mayer, welcome to the Data and Biotech podcast.
Thanks for having us.
So Kyle, Jake mentioned that Aprecia does industrial 3D printing. Would you mind just, since you've been with the company for such a long time, would you mind just orienting us to the history of Aprecia and sort of how the organization evolved and the work that you do today?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's important to kind of level set on the kind of 3D printing we do, because there are a lot of flavors of 3D printing at this point. So we do binder jet 3D printing. So that's powder liquid 3D printing. So we're laying down layers of powder of varying thickness, and we're putting a binding fluid on top of that powder to bind the particles together. And if you do that, over and over, you've created an article. In our case, it's a pharmaceutical product, but you can use that technology to make any kind of widget that you want.
Just starting from there, and I don't know, Kyle or Jake, if you're the best person to answer this, but would love to hear more about how you go from that sort of tabletop piece of equipment to these scaled up operations that you have today, and what are some of the challenges that you faced along the way that you had to sort of think through.
A lot of time and a lot of problem solving. Well, I mean, if you think about it, right? So we're the only ones in the world that have equipment like what we have, right? So it's not like we go buy the equipment and somebody comes and is like, okay, here's the manual, here's how you qualify, here's the qualification package, you're off and running, and you learned how to do this in your PhD, you experimented on this equipment. So the whole analogy of, building the bike while you ride it, building the airplane while you fly it, that's relevant here, right? And so you're trying to problem solve, not just the formulation of the process, but also the equipment, and how do you make sure that it's obviously first and foremost has to be GMP compliant. So there's a standard from the FDA, and that standard doesn't change just because you have an advanced manufacturing technology or 3D printing technology that's cool. And so there's it's always an iterative process, right? And so as innovators, you can fall into a trap where it's like, okay, we're constantly tinkering and make an improvement here. Oh, we can do this. So we can do that. And so you have to have really clear, endpoints established and say, okay, we have to focus to drive to that point. We can go deploy that technology. We can use it to do X, Y, Z. And then this is what the next innovation is going to look like. And so that's really where Jake's team's focused. And even just in the last, couple of years, we've had new innovations that we've built on top of the stuff that was from the early 2000s. And so that's where Jake's team has really spent a big bulk of their time over the last several years.
I think we have two advantages that play to our favor. Kyle's absolutely right in the sense that when it comes to, industrial scale, GMP qualifiable 3D printing, binder jetting equipment, there's ours, and there's really maybe not any other players in the world. But we do have two things that play in our favor, and that, fundamentally it's an inkjet printing process. And the inkjet printing industry is well established and has been around for quite some time. And so we can leverage a lot of the learnings and the expertise that's been developed in other industries. And similarly, even within the additive manufacturing industry and 3D printing industry, binder jetting is not exclusive to pharmaceutical binder jetting. In fact, what I was working on prior was industrial scale metal binder jet additive manufacturing. And so the pharmaceutical industry is rightfully very risk averse and slow to adopt technology. And I think that's all well justified for very good reasons as a consumer of pharmaceuticals myself. But it offers us a benefit of being able to take advantage of some of the learnings across other industries, trying to apply binder jetting and industrial 3D printing, and what are the challenges they're running into trying to scale.
Yeah, I think what would help would just be to sort of outline the manufacturing process kind of as it stands today.
Yeah.
And then with the idea that sort of understanding the manufacturing process a little bit more deeply will allow us to understand sort of how you're using sort of data and automation to enable that process, scale it up, accomplish all of the goals that you all have.
So Kyle kind of gave a brief overview of binder jetting as a 3D printing process, right? You're laying down a layer of powder, depositing a layer of printing or binding fluid, and you're, layer by layer, building an article, or in our case, a dosage form. That's traditionally referred to as a powder bed fusion process, and that's powder bed fusion. If whether you're binding with a laser, whether you're binding with a polymer, as we're doing, a polymer laden print fluid, and that's a very again established process in other industries. That sort of powder bed print fluid deposition, binder jetting. We refer to that as our open bed technology, and a lot of our previous development and historical development has been in that, open bed platform. And in fact, our drug product that's on the market, the Spretium drug product, is manufactured in that manner. Our latest technology development is what we refer to as our in-cavity 3D printing platform. And this is slightly different. Now we're taking advantage of the benefits that are provided by a blister cavity, because ultimately what we would do historically is we would 3D print in an open bed, and then you would effectively do an archaeological excavation, if you will, to recover your parts from the powder bed, and then prepare them, dedust them, and recover loose powder, inspect them, and then we would package them. And in our case, we're packaging them in blister packs. And so what we did was basically blend those two technologies together. And we said, well, what if we 3D printed a tablet directly in a blister pack? And that, has all sorts of theoretical benefits to it. And so our in-cavity platform is that. It's that premise where we deposit a layer of powder into a preformed blister cavity, and then we come over the top of that and we deposit a layer of print fluid, and we repeat that process over and over. So if you look at the process from a high level, we form our blister cards. We do that ourselves in-house, and then we load those blister cards into our in-cavity 3D printing machine, where we layer by layer, assemble or build our tablets in the blister card in their primary packaging. We'll then drive off residual solvents with a post 3D printing drying process, and then we process them through our final packaging equipment, where we'll mark the tablets, we'll lid the tablets, we'll mark the lidding, and then we'll seal those and punch out our final blister cards that are fully ready to ship off to secondary packaging or clinical trials, or an intermediate co-packer. So that's generally the overview of our in-cavity process. And then we outfit that whole production line with a range of instrumentation and collect all sorts of data along the way.
Yeah. So to elaborate on the clinical trial piece a little bit, right? So if we take, and it's not just the data here, this is also the manufacturing process that enables this. So if you're trying to, run a dose ranging study, and it's say 100x from the low end to the high end of your dose strengths that you're evaluating. Well, traditional way says, let's produce a bunch of batches and have them on stability and have those ready to go at the clinic. Well, we've heard from innovators and seen examples where they're wrong, right? And we need something that's twice as big as the biggest strength that we had when we went into the clinic. Well, that can set you back. The clinic wants it in weeks, and the formulators over here saying, well, gosh, that's going to be a few months, with traditional, manufacturing techniques. Well, if you think about our technology, right, going back to the design space, now I'm talking more on the physical process itself. If I've made Jake used the example of a 5-layer tablet. Well, the 5-layer tablet, let's say it's a 200 milligram tablet. I could make that a 10-layer tablet, and that's a 400 milligram tablet. And I could just as easily make that a 20-layer tablet, and that could be an 800 milligram. And so I could also go the other direction and go, smaller on the 200 milligrams. And so I could get a huge range, potentially beyond 100x in terms of the range from the lowest to the highest dose strength. And I don't have to change the formulation. I don't have to go make new product, with the rapid dissolving uniqueness that comes with our with our tablets. I'm not worried about it being 800 milligrams. Some people might hear that and say, well, gosh, that's a horse pill. That's way too big. We can't, you wouldn't be able to formulate that. And when you first look at it, until you've tried the tablet, you're like, yeah, we actually can't. But, once you try it and you do the demonstrator, you're like, oh, okay, it's just like swallowing water, right? The ease of administration from a patient perspective or a caregiver's perspective, or a clinician's perspective that's trying to run the clinical trial, they're like, okay, this is actually, you know, something that we're able to do quite seamlessly. And so that goes beyond just the data that allows us to actually do that, which, the data enhances the ability to run that kind of program.
Jake, would you mind sort of outlining the data platform that you have today and sort of what is the data that you're able to get off of the machines, and then how are you using that data today?
Yeah, happy to. One of the things I don't think I mentioned earlier, but it's kind of key, and Kyle mentioned this, but when we form those blister cards that we're then 3D printing our tablets into, we actually are marking each individual blister cavity with its own unique barcode. And we do that because now we can, as we're collecting data about our manufacturing process, we're collecting data about every tablet that we form, and then we have traceability back of all of that data back to the individual tablet. And it's just not practical in other, traditional pharmaceutical manufacturing processes to achieve that. But in our process, it's actually, quite achievable. And so there's a range of types of data that we're capturing along the way. Ultimately, all of that data is trying to help us make real-time quality decisions. So, we're taking a very traditional pharmaceutical quality approach, right? We develop our target product profile. This is all quality by design. Target product profile and identifying critical quality attributes, critical process parameters. And then we've outfit our equipment with as much process analytical technology as we've been able to. And we continue to develop more process analytical technology. And so we are working toward capturing and assessing and making real-time quality decisions on those critical quality attributes and monitoring our critical process parameters, and then attributing all of that, to each individual tablet.
Can you just give us some examples of what those critical quality attributes, critical process parameters look like? How they're being used, what that sort of real time process analytical technology response sort of looks like?
So we have a few different types of instruments that we incorporate throughout the manufacturing process. We've got, and for those that are familiar with PAT, right, some of these will be very familiar. So we're using near IR spectroscopy. We'll do that during the blending process, right? So we're blending to target, content uniformity during our blending process, and then we're monitoring that content uniformity on our equipment with near IR spectroscopic probes embedded into our powder dosing equipment. And then so we kind of have two critical unit operations in our 3D printing process, right? Depositing or dosing powder precisely, and then laying down our print fluid, so our print systems, right? Those are kind of the two most critical for us. And so then we have shortwave infrared imaging systems that we're looking at our deposited print fluid, and we can make a quality assessment based on, what's the health of our print systems. Did we print the image that we intended to print? Was there some sort of aberration or defect in that printing process, and we need to either correct or divert those that product stream. Beyond that, we have traditional industrial imaging systems. So we're looking at things like pharmaceutical elegance, right? We have got the benefit of forming our tablets inside of a cavity, which is wonderful. It creates a really nice surface finish on most of the tablet, but our top surface, we actually physically interact with to try and dress that surface and create a pharmaceutically elegant tablet. And so we inspect that. And then we're looking at our print quality for downstream operations as well with traditional industrial imaging technology. We're looking at the marking on the tablets. We're looking at the printing on the packaging. And we're associating all of that back to, your traditional critical quality attributes. And I forgot a key one here that I'll bring up that is a bit unique to our process. We have a 3D line scan camera that we're using to measure the deposited powder from our dosator technology. And so we can combine that technology with our spectroscopic near IR probes, and we can look at assay. We can look at, as I mentioned, content U already. We can build models to tell us if what our disintegration performance, and then in turn what our dissolution performance is going to be. So all traditional pharmaceutical critical quality attributes that are going to show up in your target product profile. And we're outfitting the equipment with the instrumentation to build the models to be able to make quality assessments directly on those CQAs in real time.
So one of the things that you mentioned was, if you notice that, for example, the surface finish of the pills isn't looking right, or maybe the content is not as uniform as you would expect it to, it doesn't compare to your ideal of what the outputted pill should look like, that you can just sort of set aside that package. And then I'm assuming, then there's a question of, okay, well, do we print again, or is there some sort of like maintenance activity that needs to happen on the machine? So that's sort of like my intuition about like what your options are when some of these flags get raised from the system. But I'm interested in, from your perspective, how do you handle sort of anomalies that occur within the system, and what are your sort of response options, and how do you go through them?
So we have all of those PAT instruments, as well as other data streams, right? Things like temperature and time, and pressure, and feed rates, speeds. All of that data is flowing into a PAT management software that we have sort of over top of our process. So we've got a number of inputs that are coming into that software, and what that software then allows us to do is build a multivariate model, and make a quality grade or a quality assessment based on a wide variety of inputs, right? So it's one thing to say, hey, I've got a single parameter and it's out of spec. But if I've got 8, 10, 12 parameters, right, it starts to get pretty complex pretty quickly. And so that's where, multivariate and in our case, chemometric modeling as well, when you talk about the spectroscopic data, comes into play, and we can start to make assessments to determine, hey, is this just a one-off, right? We had an anomalous event out of one of our unit operations, and so we don't have to worry about it. Or are we seeing trending, right? Are we seeing, no, across the board, all of our tablets? Because one of the unique things here is, again, all of these assessments are happening at the individual tablet level. So it's not a subsample, right? It's truly 100% inspection. And so we can say, hey, are we seeing, we know outright if that was an anomalous event, or if no, we're trending that way across the entire, batch. And so we can correct for that.
Kyle, I'm also interested in, from your perspective, from the leadership level of Aprecia perspective, what are sort of the highest value either uses of data that are ongoing today from the systems that Jake just described, or opportunities for data? But would love to hear sort of like what's driving a lot of value now, and then what do you expect will drive a lot more value in the future?
Yeah. So in terms of the biggest value driver, speed is something we all have to do, right? Speed to deployment. That's in the formulation development process, in the clinical development process. And then when you get to manufacturing, shortening supply chains, ensuring that you have robust supply chains so that you don't have drug shortage issues. That's a big focus, obviously, across the industry and of the federal government right now. So all the data that Jake just described, and all of the processes that we're able to monitor and pull these data sources in and make decisions, really just lead to, ability to do things quicker. And every innovator company is under pressure to do things faster and faster. And so that's, I think, the real advantage, at least the real value driver here is, okay, it's nice that we have all this data, we've got all this information, but what it translates to practically is we can do things quicker with this unique process.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Jake, back to you. If speed is of the essence, I'm assuming that your PAT system is like as close to real time as you can get it. How quickly are you? How quickly is the system sort of detecting anomalies or responding to what's happening during pill formulation?
It's somewhat counterintuitive, because Kyle's absolutely right. Like, inherently, what we can do, we're very agile, we're very quick, and inherent to the process, but the process is also iterative, so it's also slow. Right? Layer by layer, we're building a tablet and composing a tablet. So from a real-time data, like, this kind of gets like your frame of reference, right? If you're talking in terms of data, like milliseconds, microseconds in some cases, right? Like, we don't have to operate at that level. Which is a wonderful benefit we have, and also makes adapting these real-time decision-making algorithms super amenable to 3D printing as a starting point, right? Like, because eventually what you'll run into in ultra-high, ultra-fast manufacturing processes that are trying to layer on real-time decision-making, they run into a computational power and speed problem, right? We inherently don't have that problem, which is nice. But holistically, when you reframe in terms of, well, how long does it take us to formulate and manufacture and then produce, supply, and then iterate from there, we can be very fast and we can be very agile. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but I would say our process is somewhat inherently, and certainly when you talk about data speeds and data transfer rates, is slow, and so it affords us all sorts of opportunity to layer on top these real time processes and models and decision making, because we've got, you know, iterations that we're going to go through that we can take advantage of.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because this is sort of a canonical example of going slow to go fast. Like
Yeah,
you're able to,
exactly.
right? You're able to because you are sort of formulating a single pill through an iterative process, and that one pill takes longer to make. You're able to, respond better in real
Right.
time and control quality much more effectively, and iterate, innovate, change formulations much more much more rapidly than other people would be able to. So yeah, that's really interesting. So going back to what Kyle was talking about earlier in terms of having that sort of responsive system that controls quality in situ and make sure that every pill as close as possible comes out all right. Where are you on that roadmap, and what does that process look like to get into that world?
Yeah, it brings up a few interesting points too. Kyle's absolutely right that closed loop control is very much in our roadmap, very much our North Star where we're heading. Um, and we have it, we have those control loops to different degrees. I alluded to earlier that we can look at the top of our tablets and determine if the surface finish of that tablet is acceptable, and that's an example of something that, if it's not, we can recycle that blister card through the process and correct for that problem, or attempt to correct for that problem. And it really is dependent on the unit operation, the complexity associated with it, right? It's pretty easy to envision, and this is really just a technology development problem to solve in terms of making real time dose adjustments, like I alluded to earlier, from our dosing technology, right? Informed by a model that's keyed in on content uniformity of your powder blends and outputs from your laser displacement camera systems, right? And so we're working toward that, right? And we've got right now we'll prompt an operator to make a manual change, but we're working toward an automated, hands-off solution there. A less trivial challenge, and this is really true, this is a bit of a hot button topic in the additive space, which is defect detection. And we see that for us, it's in the print systems, right? So when you lay down in a fused powder bed fusion process like ours, or whether it's a binder that you're laying down or you're using a laser, right? A single defect in that process can scrap a whole part. And in our case, thankfully, we've got a fairly forgiving process to that. But you might have a print in a different industry that's printing for hours or days. And so defect detection in real time of that binding process, that fusion process, is a hot button thing across the industry. And where we've seen research coming out in inkjet space is using AI to assess images, of your deposition area, your build area, and identify defects, and then translate those images into printable, modified images that you could then recycle through and either correct the existing layer, or make a correction as a part of your next layer. And so that's a non-trivial problem, and that's probably further down the technology development roadmap.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I heard sort of at least two things that jumped out at me about your response. One was this idea that sort of the stair step toward that full automation loop is you're able to detect a problem, you prompt an operator to intervene in that problem, and then you determine whether both the prompt and the intervention are the right prompt and intervention. And then if you're
Right.
able to do that reliably enough, then you can sort of bring that into the software loop of like applying that directly. And then the other thing, the other thing I heard was that detecting the anomaly with, for example, an image based machine learning model is one thing, but then translating the problem that you've detected into instructions for the 3D printing machine to then compensate for where the problem has occurred is a whole other thing that requires a lot of learning and a lot of iteration to get to that. Am I hearing you correctly or thinking about that right?
100%. Yeah. And that's true. about industrial automation and instrumentation in general, and process analytical technology, right? Ultimately, if you're going to pursue a real-time release model and you want to have real-time assessment of a given CQA, you have to have an instrument that can detect, or as a part of a model, make an assessment of that CQA, and do so, in a time frame that is amenable to your process, right? And then, as you allude to, then if you're intending to correct and do a full, fully close the loop, do you have the mechanism on the equipment side to then be able to make that change? So it's across all of that, right? And you have to be advancing in all of those areas, to continue to drive forward, the technology, and climb up that stair step, as to use your analogy.
To shift gears a little bit, Kyle, we sort of mentioned offhand Spreetam, the first 3D printed drug approved by the
Mhm.
FDA. Would you mind just, sort of like walking us through that approval in the context of Aprecia, and then, talking about, maybe some of the lessons learned both for you and for the wider industry from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we got Spreetam approved in 2015, and that was obviously a huge moment because all the things that we've talked about that are futuristic looking. Somebody could sit here and say, "Well, gosh, how do we know we're going to ever get there? Or how do we know the regulatory framework's going to allow for it?" Well, part of us going through the approval process was to show that, hey, we can take this unique technology, we can innovate it to the point that it needs to get to, so it's GMP compliant, FDA compliant. We can pass all the established regulatory approval pathways, and de-risk it from the perspective of an innovator that might be looking at this, because that's always a question. Nobody wants the technology that produced the novel product to be a reason for slowing down the approval process. And so that was one really important reason we went through the Spreetam approval process. But back in 2015, there's we're obviously the first and still only 3D printed process. And so when we submit the application, first of all, just getting ready to submit the application is uh, a mountain of work in of itself. And we're drawing correlations for the FDA to say, okay, this is how this is similar to what you've seen in other processes. It's the first time that they're inspecting the 3D printing process. So we're trying to describe, how things are similar, and then where things are different, explain to them how we handle those differences and what kind of, scientific rationale and justification we have for, the parameters that went into the NDA and certain specifications that we have. And so, the FDA is really our partner. It was really, quite collaborative. Even after we got the approval, the FDA, after our prior approval inspection, sent it was probably close to 30 inspectors back out afterwards, which, if you're any company, you're like, okay, well, we got 30 FDA inspectors showing up, but it was for training. It was, them saying, okay, these guys did it. We got through the approval process with flying colors, and no issues at all. And so you're now starting to set the standard of what it looks like to be, an advanced manufacturing and a 3D printing manufacturer in the industry. And so that's really the huge benefit to going first.
Can I ask you to educate us here? So what, like, what is it about the inkjet layer by layer
Yeah.
approach that sort of separates it from the extrusion approach in the context of pharmaceutical manufacturing?
Yeah. So part of the reason I'd say two of the reasons we picked it were speed and flexibility. So let's start with the flexibility piece. We don't have any novel excipients that we have to use in the process. We're able to use commonly used pharmaceutical excipients. And I mentioned the kind of compatibility that we have with different actives. Uh, it's a gentle process in terms of the heat and the solvent that we would expose it to, the actives that is. And so, it's really amenable to working with any active, and we can be really flexible on the kinds of excipients that we bring in. So that was important to us because when you're talking to formulators, we're not trying to sell some novel excipient, or hey, you have to do it this way because it's the only thing that works for us. We've got flexibility to say, hey, what have you seen from some of your early formulation work? What would you like us to try? And so it can be a collaborative effort too as we educate them on 3D printing. So then the speed piece, from a scale perspective, we saw a lot of advantages there with binder jetting. extrusion. It's People have seen extrusion equipment. I mean, you can extrude a tablet at a time, and you have to have a bunch of nozzles to extrude more than one tablet. Well, with print areas, you're able to print more than one tablet at a time underneath an inkjet printer. And so, just the ability to scale up and move the process faster and get to commercially relevant throughputs was a big advantage that we saw. And so those were really the two reasons that we picked it, were the speed and the flexibility of the process.
And just to add on to that, I think if you would, to go back to our earlier discussion around how do you develop technology, and to take this sort of 30,000-foot view on how do you drive adoption of a new technology, which is really what we're trying to do, and breaking into an industry that this is foreign to, right? Well, it's gonna be that much harder of a sell to try and convince formulators to pick a technology that also has all this risk on the mat side, or they have no familiarity with any of it, and they don't have any processes or any infrastructure or internal knowledge base on which they can draw to formulate for that material set and then that equipment set. And so binder jetting is familiar, right? In the sense that it's a powder based system. We're using the same half of the process train they may already have when it comes to powder blending and powder milling and preparation of those powder blends for the system, right? And so just to reinforce what Kyle was alluding to, the fact that the excipients are common. It's all FDA approved already. We didn't have to seek new approvals, right? And there are modalities out there that are not being used, 3D printing modalities that could be used if there were, FDA approved material sets out there. And eventually, people will choose to break into those and be the tip of the spear to go do the mat sci and get the approvals to do that. But until then, and in terms of adoption, the fastest path is to stick with what people know. And that also kind of goes into like the stair-step approach to iteration and technology. Even if we could do the massive leap to full closed loop, 100% lights out manufacturing, autonomous control, there's an argument to be made that our customers would be scared off by that, right? And that keeping the human in the loop is actually really important. And they have so much experience to draw on, and know how to make good pharmaceutical drug product, right?
3D printing, it clearly works. You've proven that you can do it in a GMP compliant manner. You've talked about the benefits that can accrue to, in particular clinical development programs where, with that flexibility and that responsiveness, that fast iteration cycle it is sort of needed. But I'm interested in, what are the barriers to 3D printing becoming one of the default technologies that are used for manufacturing pharmaceuticals versus sort of remaining in this role of being more focused on, innovation, flexibility, responsiveness, that sort of thing?
The first aim of our technology is not to go compete with a tablet press, right? So if it's ibuprofen and you're going to make billions and billions and billions of tablets a year, the goal isn't to go, at least right now, replace the tablet press in terms of that. The throughput of some of that equipment is going to be a bit faster on a tablet press. Maybe not from total cycle time, but just from like the number of tablets per hour. And so you can, obviously produce parts and tablets for pennies per tablet. So that's, for genericized products or products that are, OTC or widely available that, don't have any kind of uniqueness because they're really well established, that makes sense. And we tell people to go do that. If you can make it on a tablet press and the process runs just fine and the active is in good shape and it's stable and doesn't degrade, and you've got a manufacturing process in a tablet you're happy with, that's probably the spot for you. The thing that we see though is more and more of the newer products require, so I think it's like, I've heard different numbers, 60 to 80% of products are requiring some sort of solubility enhancement technique. So there's several ways, and we've presented publicly on some of those things with different partners. There's ways that we can address challenges there. One way I've heard it characterized is all the easy molecules are gone, right? The easy molecules would be stuff you would put on a tablet press and just kind of run. The more complex ones are the ones that we're seeing now, and that's what requires our advanced manufacturing and our form of manufacturing is they're either derivatives of existing products, different salt forms, and those salt forms may have stability issues when they're exposed to different parts of a traditional process. And so I think that's what's going to drive more adoption of 3D printing. So whether it's ever going to be, a mainstream, every tablet in the entire world is going to be made via 3D printing, I won't go that far out on that limb. There's a lot of technologies out there, and several of them have been around for a really long time, but the adoption, I think, will be facilitated by the more unique and challenging products that are constantly being developed and presented to us.
I've got two thoughts I think I might add to that. So one is, if you take a big picture approach, we're in the phase of history that is referred to as Industry 4.0 or Pharma 4.0. And if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, you kind of look at how we've been developing, right? This is the era of the big data and layering all of that on top of your automated manufacturing, and now you can make really informed decisions about how you manufacture your drug products. And so, there's speculation on what's coming next beyond that, and we're still, as an industry, and not just our industry, but worldwide, really still working to get fully into the Industry 4.0, Pharma 4.0 space. But what's beyond that? And one of the things that I've heard speculated on is sort of like mass personalization, right? So everything we've built up until now has been to drive manufacturing efficiency. And so you've got large centralized manufacturing plants and running dedicated products at high volumes. And we as the consumers select from which of those high volume products meet our needs the best. But the next generation of technology, manufacturing wave, and we're seeing a desire, us as the consumer, to want personalized products, right? And so we envision, again, with our ability to produce down to an individual blister card or even an individual tablet uniquely, we see a line of sight toward, our technology adapting to personalized medicine really well. And if the wave of industry demands mass personalization, which is personalized medicine produced at scale to meet the public's needs, I think we have a platform where we can see 3D printing really serving the need there. And I think the other thing I'd add, and this kind of gets back to kind of what you were talking about earlier with misconceptions, a lot of what we're doing is just education at this point, right?
Jake, one last data question before as we head toward the end, given all this data that you're capturing, are you using digital twins or simulation of your manufacturing processes at all? And if so, how are you using them?
Digital twin is one of my favorite words in the industry right now, because if you ask 10 people, I think you get 10 different answers on what a digital twin is.
For sure.
I heard a good presentation. I was at IFPAC, which is an industry conference on advanced technologies every year. And there was a presenter there from a company called Izon, and he distinguished, he sort of tranched it into three main groupings. There's like your simulations. And so when some people think about digital twin, what they really think about is a simulation. And we're doing that, right? We're trying to simulate our processes and trying to understand for a certain set of inputs, what are our outputs. And then we use that information to design better equipment, or we use that information to inform formulation, right? He introduced another one that I thought was really apt, and it's, he called it a digital shadow. And so this is building a model and letting that model, feeding that model off of historical data, and then letting that model sort of define your parameters, and it might make, it might present adjustments, but it's all based on historical data. And then there's sort of like the truest form of a digital twin, which is it's layered on top of your process. It's collecting data in real time, and the model is self-optimizing on the real-time data, and making decisions, and inputting that back into your process parameters in real time. And so that's maybe the most advanced, version of what a true digital twin is, or at least the best definition I think I heard of it. We're absolutely working on the first two. The third one is one I'm super keen on. Again, I think it's in our roadmap. As we're stair-stepping our way there, we'll work toward that. I think that one brings a lot of, Kyle spent some time talking about, the FDA and regulation. Certainly when you get to that level of automation and hands-off and AI involvement, everyone gets to starts to get real nervous. And there's already white papers being published and guidances being published by the FDA, and it's just it's a topic that is ripe for discussion. And so I don't think we're there yet to really know with a lot of confidence exactly where it's going to go from a regulatory standpoint. And in the meantime, the technology has to play catch up anyway, so that's maybe a good thing. But yeah, it's very much on our roadmap. We're very interested. We think we're building the basis, the foundation on our equipment platform now to be able to enable that type of high level autonomous digital twin down the road. Automation is an interesting thing. Again, this kind of comes to your frame of reference. Like if I were to tell you a closed loop control model, on a temperature controller, you'd be like, you don't bat an eye, right? That's on every oven and every manufacturing facility across the world, and no one thinks twice about it. But that's making real-time decisions to try and, it's got a P and ID loop. They're trying to maintain a set point. And fundamentally, that's automation. It's hands off. It's, no one interacts with it at that point. When you start to go higher up the tree and you start to get more variables involved, and it becomes more abstract to the operator what's actually happening and what are the inputs that are driving a set of outputs that the machine is either autonomously correcting for or prompting an operator or recommending to an operator to correct for, it gets more uncomfortable and stickier, right? And so the tide will rise and we'll get there, but certainly in the near term, as we consider digital twinning, the simulation and the digital shadows are absolutely projects we have ongoing, and then the proper fully autonomous AI enabled real-time digital twins is something on our roadmap.
Kyle, looking toward the future, how do you see the 3D printing platform that Aprecia has and 3D printing more broadly, transforming pharma in, let's say, the next 5 years?
One area that we touched on a little bit is this agile distributed manufacturing environment, right? So taking the platform that we've built and deploying it in that kind of environment is going to be it's already getting a lot of attention from the federal government. It's already getting a lot of attention from regulators, and we're seeing commercial partners ask questions about how we might be able to supply their products in that kind of supply chain. So we've talked a lot about the data and the PAT, and I think you need all of those things in order to enable that. It's not just, hey, we've got a piece of equipment that can make the part. You have to have the whole system, the IT infrastructure, the data infrastructure around it to be able to deploy in that environment. So I think that's one, area where 3D printing and Aprecia's technology is going to be able to play a really big role. And that could be deployed in, it could be for drug shortage purposes. It could be for supply chain security or robustness purposes. Like there's more than one use case when it comes to distributed or agile manufacturing. And so I think the other area in the next 5 to 10 years, and we touched on it a little bit, is the ability to make these unique products. And they're not going to get easier. Products are going to get more and more complex. People are trying to go biologics to injectables over to the oral delivery form, and then you've got all of the new chemical entities that are coming along that require some sort of solubility enhancement or advanced manufacturing or advanced handling. And then you've got the wave of like Jake said, personalization. Everybody wants to get on Amazon and order the thing that they want, or Etsy and order the thing that they want, and it's personalized to them and it's delivered in a day or two. So I think it's a matter of time before pharmaceuticals is moving in that direction. And again, there's we think unique advantages for how our technology gets deployed. And so we've talked a lot about speed and flexibility, and those things are, I think as you're sitting here listening, you're probably like, well, there's a lot that you can do. And it comes down to how do you focus on certain things to really drive those? Because if you focus on everything, you're not going to, accomplish anything. But, Aprecia's had a track record of being able to, focus on certain things, get it to the point where it's deployable, and then move on to the next big project. And so I think that's where we're headed in the next 5 to 10 years with the technology.
Awesome. One question for the room before we head toward the end, are there any either existing or emerging applications of AI that you all are really excited about that you think have the potential to make Aprecia more effective, or, make the work that you do more applicable to more client problems?
We've got all the manufacturing and processing data, so we know what works and, what an optimal formulation is, or formulations, and excipient blends for our equipment look like. So where you where we're headed is, and some of these are tools that Aprecia's, having to build because they're unique to our process, but where you're headed is the ability to do a full material characterization on an active. And by the time the physical powder hits our door, um, we're able to, with a high degree of confidence, predict a formulation. So you can use, with enough robust, good, validated data that, the team has developed, produce, these algorithms that are going to tell you, okay, this is where we think it should be because you're trying to hit this target product profile. These are the characteristics of the molecule, and it can start to drive you in a direction pretty quickly. And then, again, humans still in the loop, or on the loop at least, right, from a formulator's perspective, saying, all right, that makes sense, or that doesn't make sense. We need to tweak this, or, there may be some excipient that the innovator says, well, we've had experience with this one and it's incompatible. So then you have to make a switch. But just the ability to speed things up, and not just speed things up, but give you a really well thought through, validated formulation suggestion or suggestions that you can have a high degree of confidence and say, we can quickly prototype these things and you can make sure you're happy with it. And then we can quickly, without many changes, get into the clinic. And then you can experience all the benefits that we kind of talked about, from the clinical development side. So I think those AI tools on the front side, because there's a lot of AI tools in drug discovery and whatnot, and we're not that far upstream in drug discovery, but in terms of deploying AI in the early development process and, processing and manufacturing process development is a real area that's ripe for development.
Very interesting. Jake?
I tend to be somewhat conservative, I think, in terms of the influence I think AI may have at the, drug product manufacturing level, right? For all the reasons I kind of alluded to earlier, right? I think there's a lot of regulatory and questions that still need to be answered, but I think we'll be working in the background on those tools, and then when those answers are more concrete, you'll start to see those rolled out. But I do think, like Kyle alluded to, all of the inputs to those, the manufacturing process are right for leveraging those tools. And I'm personally, I think in the next 3 to 5 years, we'll see quite a bit of just, and this is not pharma or even 3D pre specific, but our day-to-day business operations and engineering operations processes being able to be assisted by AI tools. And what I'm hopeful for is that frees up that much more time in my day and my team's day to focus on the technology problems that we want to spend our time solving, but we may not feel that inefficiency. But AI may help expose, right, some of those ways we can offload tasks that we've been doing mindlessly for decades at this point, and now we can leverage AI and free us up to go work on different problems. So super optimistic for that, in addition to sort of the more pharma specific and 3D printing specific applications.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate both of your time today. Before I let you go, where can people go to learn more about Aprecia and get in touch with you?
Yeah. So our website, aprecia.com. I know our LinkedIn is got a lot of our recent updates and whatnot. My LinkedIn's out there too. The marketing team would like, I've suggested that they can take that over and they can post as much as they want on my LinkedIn. So go to the corporate LinkedIn, go to the Aprecia LinkedIn site. That's where they can find more.
Awesome. Well, Kyle and Jake, it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I really appreciate the time and look forward to connecting down the line.
Yeah. Thanks for having us, Ross. Enjoyed our time.
Been a pleasure.
And that's it for this episode of Data in Biotech. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, rate, or leave a review in your podcast platform of choice. See you next time.